My last video was all about the recently passed Great American Outdoors Act, a key component of which was fully funding the Land and Water Conservation Fund. I briefly talked about the LWCF in that video, but given its importance in America's conservation landscape, I wanted to dedicate an entire video to it here. The need for some sort of funding mechanism for America's public lands was recognized after World War II, when national parks and other protected areas became increasingly popular, but increasingly overcrowded as well. Congress then convened the Outdoor Recreation Resources Review Commission, which was tasked with providing recommendations on the future outdoor recreation needs of the nation. Among others, the commission recommended a funding mechanism for acquiring both state and federal lands to meet the increased demand for outdoor recreation. Thus, in 1965, Congress passed the Land and Water Conservation Fund Act, creating the LWCF that we see today. It has been a popular yet chronically underfunded source of money for conservation and recreation projects across the United States. Initially, no funding amount was set for the newly created LWCF. It would accrue different amounts in different years, but in 1978, Congress authorized the LWCF to accrue $900 million annually, the level at which it still sits today. The fund can also accrue amounts above and beyond the $900 million annually due to stipulations in the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act, or GOMESA for short, although these accruals have historically been relatively small. But accruing this amount and this amount being spent on conservation projects are two different things. See, Congress still has to appropriate the money in the fund so that it can be used on those conservation projects. This is because appropriations come in two forms: mandatory and discretionary. Mandatory appropriations are just as they sound. The money is required to be spent. Discretionary appropriations, on the other hand, mean that Congress can choose whether or not to spend the money on LWCF projects or divert it to other funding sources. Unfortunately, Congress has often chosen the latter when it comes to LWCF funds. To better understand this, you can think of the Land and Water Conservation Fund like a bucket. Money will flow into that bucket automatically, but it can't be taken out and spent unless Congress says so. And when they do say so, they rarely allow the full amount to be taken out. The Land and Water Conservation Fund has only been fully funded twice in its entire history. In fact, the LWCF has accrued roughly $40.9 billion since it was created, but only $18.9 billion has been spent by Congress, leaving $22 billion unspent in the fund. As I mentioned in last week's video, though, the Great American Outdoors Act changes all of this. The act stipulates that the LWCF will be fully funded and fully appropriated in perpetuity. But how does money get into the Land and Water Conservation Fund in the first place? Unlike a lot of government funding, money for the LWCF does not come from taxpayers like you and me. Instead, the Land and Water Conservation Fund gets its money from offshore oil and gas leases, the idea being that money gained from the depletion of one resource could be used to help conserve another. Oil and gas leases provide the biggest chunk of revenue for the LWCF, but they aren't the only source of funding. Profits from the sale of federal land and taxes on motorboat fuel are also deposited into the fund. Recreation fees used to be placed into the fund as well, but haven't been since 1990. Now, in terms of what the Land and Water Conservation Fund can be used for, there are three main components: national funding, state funding, and other purposes. National funding is used almost exclusively for land acquisition, albeit in specific ways. National funds are used to either acquire inholdings, which are pieces of private property surrounded entirely by public land, or to acquire properties that would improve recreational access to already publicly owned land. LWCF funds for states are where things get a bit more interesting, though. These funds are administered by the National Park Service through grants to the states, which can be used on recreation planning, land acquisition, and development or redevelopment of recreation areas. These grants are called matching grants, meaning that the states, or their project sponsors, must put up a certain portion of the funding themselves in order to receive the grant. They must also maintain an updated outdoor recreation plan to receive funding. Additionally, these grants are awarded based on a rather complicated formula. One part of the formula does call for equal funding among the states, meaning that each state will receive at least some funding, but other factors play into this formula as well, and state population has traditionally been the one with the most influence. No state can receive more than 10% of the grant money, however. And, since 2014, Congress has appropriated funds for a competitive grant program as well. These grants are intended to serve more densely populated urban areas that have traditionally lacked access to outdoor recreation opportunities. The last component of LWCF funding is reserved for what are called other purposes. These were not originally specified in the LWCF Act, but were left up to the President to request LWCF funding for various other projects, subject to congressional approval. These funds have been used on everything from historic preservation to deferred maintenance over the years, and presidents don't always get what they ask for. Since 2008, however, these funds have primarily gone to two main programs: the Forest Legacy Program, which aims to help conserve privately owned forests, and the Cooperative Endangered Species Conservation Fund, which provides grants to states and territories for endangered species conservation on non-federal land. Historically, the percentage of LWCF money devoted to each of these components has fluctuated wildly since 1965. Initially, more money was devoted to state grants than to federal funding, but this pattern began to reverse itself in the 1980s until the current proportions were determined. Currently, 40% is devoted to national funding, 40% to state funding, and the remaining 20% goes to other purposes. And that's the Land and Water Conservation Fund, a mainstay of conservation funding over the last half-century. Whether it's been used for acquiring land or developing recreation areas, the LWCF has been vital to the protection of natural areas across the country, and has included projects in every single county in America. Historically underfunded, the Land and Water Conservation Fund will receive a new lease on life with the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act, and will look to continue its legacy of protecting our most precious natural resources. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about national parks and other protected areas, please consider liking and subscribing below. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.